All right, we are in Hosea chapter 8. Hosea chapter 8. Does anybody have any Bible questions this morning before we get going?
You got a lot to cover.
I do have a lot to cover. Thank you. No pressure, yeah. Hosea chapter 8. Let's take a look at verse 4. Hosea chapter 8, verse 4. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but without my knowledge. With their silver and gold they made idols for their own destruction. That was the problem with Israel. They made princes, but not through me. Talk to me about this passage. What comes to your mind as you read this, Hosea chapter 8 and verse 4? Hosea 8, verse 4. For me, I think of very early on in Israel's history, in the book of 1 Samuel, when the people went to Samuel and they said, basically, we reject God as our king and we want a king like the other nations. And Samuel warned them not to go that route in multiple different ways. And yet they went ahead and did it, and it brought them all kinds of misery and problems throughout the years when they rejected God as their king. What else comes to your mind when you read verse 4? Hosea chapter 8.
We did a lot in our daily lives. Oh, I've got a good idea. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And it might not turn out right if we don't pray about it and wait for it. Right?
Yeah, there's a passage in the book of James, chapter 4, at the very end of that chapter, that says, basically there were these two businessmen who were talking, and they said, tomorrow we're going to go here and do such and such deal. And James says, you should have included God in your plans. Yeah, and I think that's the idea here in Hosea 8, verse 4 as well. Notice the emphasis on idols as well in this passage. With their silver and gold, they made idols for their own destruction. They made idols that couldn't save them, that couldn't bring them up out of Egypt, that couldn't deliver them from Assyria. Instead of trusting in the one who created them, they instead trusted in works of their own hands. And I think, like what Ms. D is saying, these are things that we do in our own lives too. You know, instead of trusting in God, we trust in our own plans, our own abilities, our own schemes, instead of allowing God to work through us.
They were also like setting up leaders or whatever they wasn't approved by God. It goes on into this day sometimes, if you're not, right and doing whatever, it's not going to work. They were setting up kings, without the consent. Choosing those leaders did not meet God's approval. It seems like that.
Richard.
Well, really? Such a ball. So calm as a cucumber.
I want to share with you this next passage here, verse 5. He says, your calf is rejected, O Samaria. My anger burns against them. But then he says this, how long will they be incapable of innocence? And how long will they be incapable of innocence? What does that kind of speak to?
Anybody can make a stupid mistake, but once it's apparent that it's a mistake, you back off. But once you go so far, you can't back off.
I think that means something totally different. I'm sorry, I disagree with you, but when it says, in my version, it says, how long until they attend to innocence.
Oh, okay.
They've done all this. They've created all these false gods and everything else. I mean, how long are you going to basically keep digging your own hole before you dig yourself out?
Yeah.
Basically, what I'm getting at. I mean, they've got these idols. They've got these kings, these princes. They've created all materialistic things, and yet they're surrounded by them, and now there's no way out. I mean,
yeah.
Except for just to throw everything in a big old pit and say, you know what, God, we're sorry.
Right, and they're unwilling to do that, right? What other thoughts do you have on this passage?
With the reference to idols made of silver and gold, sometimes I can kind of run past that and think, well, I don't have any idols from silver and gold, so this must not apply to me. But not all idols are made out of silver and gold.
Yeah, even what we give our attention to can be our idol, right? When he says here that they are incapable, they are unable to attend to innocence, then I think the idea here is that they have a heart problem. It's not that they are just refusing to do good. It's that they've gone so far away from God that they can't do good. They can't bring themselves to do good. I think that this is the opposite of what Jesus is working out in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. When Jesus is talking about how we shouldn't murder, but we also shouldn't even hate our brother, or how we shouldn't commit adultery, but we also shouldn't even lust after someone else, he's moving a little bit deeper than just surface level actions. He's trying to get to the heart of the matter, right? And here in Hosea 8, the problem is that their heart was all wrong. Since they didn't know God, they were incapable of innocence. They were incapable of doing what was right because they were so far removed from the presence of God. And Jesus' teaching, like for example in the Sermon on the Mount, was to create the kind of person who the good fruit just naturally comes to. You naturally love your neighbor as yourself. You naturally treat others with respect and kindness and don't kill and don't steal and things like that. It's not something that someone has to tell you not to do. You just naturally do it from being transformed into the image of God through the Spirit. Jeremy, did you have something back there? Do what?
I thought I was going to take it away.
Oh, okay. How long will they be incapable of innocence? All right. Moving on here, let's take a look at verse 7. This is a popular passage from Hosea that you're probably familiar with. You probably heard it quoted before. He says, "For they sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads, it shall yield no meal. If it were to yield, foreigners would devour it." The idea here is that basically they are laying down in the bed that they made. They are experiencing the things that they have sown for themselves. This is not unexpected. This outcome is not shocking. God warned them what would happen if they went down this route. They went down the route, and now here they are basically at the time of their destruction. And you look here at the harvest imagery. He says, "The standing grain has no heads, it shall yield no meal." Keep in mind the harvest imagery is something that really got started in chapter 1. Remember in chapter 1, one of Hosea's children's names was Jezreel, which means God sows or God plants. And so there's several times throughout Hosea 1, at the end of Hosea 1, at the end of Hosea 2, and a couple times leading up to this point where harvest imagery is employed. And basically the idea here is Hosea is saying, look around at the fields. You don't see anything. In other words, if you look at Israel, you don't see any good fruit. There's not going to be any harvest. And if there was to be a harvest, he said, foreigners would devour it. Basically, you have sown nothing, and you're about to reap everything. There's a coming destruction, in other words.
I think that could be a metaphor for today.
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't mean to step on anybody's political toes, but we've sold so much of America, we don't even own it anymore. It's like 85%. Businesses, farmlands, everything else. It's kind of like when the Jews sold themselves to the Egyptians. You know, I mean, Jews were slaves, yes, but they sold their stock, they sold their lands, they sold everything, and then they became slaves because they were owned by it. And that's basically what America is right now. We're owned by foreign countries. We've sold so much of us, of America, businesses-wise, and even farmland and everything else, that we don't have anything to fall back on. And I think that's what it's saying here, where it says foreigners, basically, or aliens, or whatever you want to call them, own. You know, they're taking it all because it's theirs.
Yeah. Well, whenever you sell yourself out, don't be surprised when you don't have possession of yourself anymore, right? And I think that's the point here. They sold themselves to false gods, and so they shouldn't be surprised that there's nothing left, right? What else do you have? All right, let's look at verse 8. This is important here in Hosea chapter 8. Israel is swallowed up. Now they are among the nations as a useless vessel. This idea of Israel being swallowed up is brought up a lot in discussions of the history of the northern tribes and southern tribes. The southern tribes were carried into Babylonian captivity, right? They were carried into Babylonian captivity for 70 years, and they got to come back home, reconstruct their city, reconstruct their temple, etc. The northern tribes, however, were swallowed up among the nations. They weren't identifiable anymore like the southern kingdom was. They were assimilated into cultures. They lost their identity. They lost their holy places. And so they didn't have a return from exile like Judah did. Those who joined themselves to the southern kingdom, such as Anna, remember her in the book of Luke, she was of the tribe of Asher, I think. Is that right? Anybody remember what tribe Anna was a part of in Luke chapter 2? Sounds right? Well, if it sounds right, we'll just go with that. The point is that there was a remnant who had joined themselves to the southern kingdoms, but by and large, they were swallowed up. This is why one of the major themes in Old Testament prophecy is the restoration of Israel under the son of David. The idea, as we saw back in Hosea chapter 3, for instance, that there was coming a time whenever David, really the son of David, would sit again on the throne and would bring Israel and Judah back together. Not just Judah, but Israel and Judah. And the New Testament authors, when they're writing about the life and times of Jesus, as we're going to see in our study of the book of Amos, for example, they look back, they look at the life of Jesus as fulfilling those promises. They look at Jesus' life and ministry and work and gospel as bringing together once more Judah and Israel into one body in Christ. So that's just an interesting idea here in verse 8, but Israel is swallowed up by the nations. She's lost her identity through her exile. Let's see. Let's keep going here. We got, as Josh said, we have quite a bit to look at here. And as I mentioned before, we're not going to look at every single passage in Hosea. We are kind of giving you a bird's eye view. Did you have something, Miss D? Oh, you looked excited there for a second. Let's see. Let's go to Hosea chapter 10. Skip over ahead a little bit and look at verse 8. And remember, the purpose of that handout I gave you is so that you can work through Hosea a lot on your own as well. All right, Hosea chapter 10, verse 8. This passage is interesting because it's quoted a lot in the New Testament. Somebody read Hosea 10 and verse 8 for us, please.
The high places of David and the sin of Israel shall be destroyed. Thorn and thistle shall grow up on their altars. They shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us.
All right. So their holy places are going to be destroyed. Thorns and thistles are going to cover up their altars, as Richard read for us. But then there's this last little line here. They shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. There are several places in the minor prophets and the major prophets where they almost say the exact same thing. There is a parallel passage to this, just as a for instance, in the book of Isaiah chapter 2. Your center column reference might have it, it might not. But if you look at the end of Isaiah chapter 2, you'll see a very similar idea here. He says in Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 21 that they would have to, they would enter the rocks and the clefts from the terror of the Lord and from the glory of his majesty. And they would do this to basically hide from the coming destruction that was at hand. And this is what's happening in Hosea chapter 10 as well. They're saying to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us, because of how horrible the destruction was. They wanted to be able to hide in the mountains, basically, from the punishment that was coming from Assyria. This passage is interesting because it is cited a couple times in the New Testament. If you have a center column reference, see if you can figure out what that is. There should be two places at least where this passage is cited in the New Testament.
I mean, look, I can't see it, but I'm sure it's talking about when they're destruction. There's one that went up into the mountains and that's what hid. Is that it?
Yeah, there's I think it's in, somebody correct me if I'm wrong here if you got a center column reference, but I'm pretty sure it's Luke chapter 23. Is that right? And what verse is it, Tina?
23,
Oh, you can't see. Is it too tiny?
Revelation 6:16. Luke 23:30.
Luke 23:30?
no, also in Revelation.
That's right. Revelation 6:16 and Luke 23:30. And Luke 23:30, the scene is this. Jesus is carrying his cross. He's on his way to be crucified. There's a group of women who are following after him, and he turns around to them and he says, do not weep for me, daughters of Jerusalem, but weep for yourselves and for your children. And then he cites to them this passage from Hosea chapter 10 and verse 6, that there's a coming a day when you'll say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. The other passage that Josh and Tina both mentioned was Revelation 6. Would you say 16? Is that right? In Revelation 6, there's this book that has 7 seals on it. And the Lamb of God comes to open up all the seals. And when the Lamb opens up the 6th seal, I believe it was, and the great day of wrath has come, that's when John the Revelator cites Hosea chapter 6, or rather Hosea chapter 10 and Isaiah chapter 2 to talk about, what was happening in those days. The kings of the earth would say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. So it's just interesting how the New Testament uses the Old Testament. And we might not even recognize that it's doing it if we don't pay attention, to the center column reference. And sometimes Bibles will have other tools to point those sorts of things out to you. The point again, though, is these passages had a relevance for their day and time. In the 8th century BC, when Israel was being carried away into Assyrian captivity, but they also had relevance for Jesus' day and time. They saw these things playing out in the same kind of patterns, same kind of routine in their own time as well. And like John has already mentioned for us, because of that, we could extrapolate and say, hey, look, we're kind of following the same patterns that they followed. We're turning away from God, or we're making idols for ourselves. And what's the result of that? Well, you sow the wind and you get the whirlwind. We can kind of basically see where we're headed by what we're doing, based off of the history. As they say, history repeats itself, right? We can look at what happened to them when they did these same things that we're doing, and we can kind of tell what's coming in the future, basically, to use that language. It's not saying that we're fortune tellers or prophesying, but it's warning, right? Like, for example, if your son's going to go touch the stove and you tell him not to, you know what's going to happen if he touches the stove. And many passages in the Bible basically function like that. God says, if you go down this path, this is where you're going to end up. And so don't be surprised when you find yourself there. All right, so instead of sowing the wind and reaping the whirlwind, let's look at Hosea chapter 10 and verse 12. Hosea 10 and verse 12. We have this harvest imagery continued here, and it's actually going to go down through verse 13. But really, you could read verse 14 and 15 as well. But somebody read Hosea 10, 12 and 13. Hosea 10, 12 and 13.
Sow for yourselves righteousness, reap in mercy. Break up your fallow ground. For it is time to seek the Lord, till he comes and rains righteousness on you. You have plowed wickedness, you have reaped iniquity, you have eaten the fruits of lies, because you trusted in your own way, and the multitude of your mighty men.
All right. Verse 12, he says, basically, instead of sowing the wind, or instead of sowing wickedness and injustice, you should instead sow for yourselves righteousness. And what you reap from that is steadfast love. This, again, agricultural imagery is so common in the New Testament because agriculture is so common to human beings. In the book of Galatians chapter 6, for example, the Apostle Paul talks about how we are to sow for ourselves spiritual things, and you reap spiritual things. But if you sow for yourself fleshly things, you reap fleshly things. The prophet Hosea is trying to reorient the people to a life of righteousness, justice, and love, instead of continuing down the path of wickedness, injustice, and deceit here in verse 13. You got something, Jeremy?
I was just thinking, about last week, we talked about how things are flipping around in that passage of Galatians. I think the end says, it says, sow evil, you're going to get evil. You sow good, you're going to get good. But they grow weary here. Hosea's talking about the things that fallen have come upon them.
Yeah.
They wore them out, and they're tired of all the bad things. But Paul says, he said, sow good, but when the time comes to start reaping the harvest, don't get
Yeah. Basically, our actions have consequences. We got to learn to accept it, right? Yeah. All right. There's another little line here. Your versions might read differently, where he says, end of verse 13, rather. Because you have trusted in your way. What other translations are out there? Because you've trusted in your way. At the end of verse 13.
Dependent on your own strength.
Dependent in your own strength. Okay. What else?
I don't know. I think it means here that because you've done your own thing, you're going to reap your own. You followed these men. It says that, and the multitude of your mighty men. You basically created your own situation, and now you've got to get out of it. And in number 12, it's kind of like, I don't know. I'm getting something completely different. He said, "You sow yourself righteousness, reap mercy," and then it says, break up your fallow ground. Okay, fallow means soiled ground or bad ground, right?
Yeah.
And for this time, seek for the Lord. Okay, destroy what was once, so that you can get back to the way it should be. This is what it. I mean, it's. I'm dyslexic, so it says completely different things to me than it does normal people. So, for it is time to seek the Lord till He comes and rains righteousness on you. Okay, so it's telling you to get rid of the bad stuff.
Yeah.
So that the good stuff can come in, and
right.
The Lord's going to come and He's going to make you right again.
Yeah, it's interesting that imagery of God raining His righteousness on you, and so the increase ultimately comes from God. We prepare the ground, we ready ourselves, we sow righteousness, as he says here, we sow mercy, and then when God rains on us, we get the benefit of that. What happens if it rains though, and the ground hasn't been prepared, the ground hasn't been made ready, and seeds haven't been planted?
Ain't nothing going to grow.
Yeah, nothing's going to grow. But even worse, what might happen, Jeremy? Weeds and briars, or it could wash out completely, right? If it's not ready. Okay. There is, in verse 13, where he says, because you've trusted in your chariots, because you've trusted in your way, there is some think this could be a figure of speech. Because you've trusted in the road, you trusted in the way. Some translate this because you trusted in chariots. And then he says after that, in the multitude of your warriors, after that in verse 13. Now, the idea here is, regardless of whether or not it says chariots or way, the point is you're trusting in your own strength instead of God's strength. You think that because you have built up this great army, because you have these holy places, because you have these wonderful generals or whatever, that you're going to be able to sustain the attack from Assyria. But he's like, that's not going to happen. You have this strength, but whenever, he says in verse 14, whenever war comes up against your people, all of your cities and all of your fortresses are going to be destroyed. It's not going to be pretty. And that just reminds us, a common theme in Scripture, that God gives the victory in battle. It's not who has the mightiest warriors or the best chariots or whatever it is, that God gives the victory. And that's the theme from the very beginning and with Pharaoh and his armies, right? In the book of Exodus. Pharaoh had the mightiest army of all, and yet he couldn't conquer Israel whenever God decided to let Israel go. Yep. All right, let's come to, we did Hosea 11 last week, but let's go to Hosea 11 and verse 8. We have a nice passage here. Hosea 11, verse 8 and 9. There's a lot of historical references in this passage, but I think that the main point of it will be taken. So let's read Hosea chapter 11, 8 and 9, somebody. Hosea 11, 8 and 9.
How can I give you up, Egypt? How can I hand you over Israel? How can I treat you like Edom? How can I make you like my heart is changed within me, all my compassion is aroused. I may not carry out my fierce anger, or will I turn in this day evil. For I am God and not man, the Holy One among you. I will not come in wrath.
All right. Now, this is kind of backwards from everything that we've read so far, isn't it, in Hosea? We read all about destruction, and now we read about salvation. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? The idea here throughout all the minor prophets is that though destruction was coming, that wouldn't be the ultimate end, that restoration was in the future for God's people. And that would ultimately come through, of course, through the Messiah. And so throughout all of Hosea, we read about judgment, we read about justice, we read about captivity, but then after this, as you're going to see at the very end of Hosea, we read about restoration and reconciliation. Though God would put away Israel, as was discussed in Hosea 1 through 3, he would remarry her through the Messiah, as we talked about in Hosea chapter 3. And so here he says, basically, that Ephraim and Israel being given up and handed over wouldn't be a permanent arrangement, but they would be restored. They would be returned to the land. Whenever we read here about Admah and Zeboim, these two cities are historically connected to Sodom and Gomorrah. Whenever Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, it wasn't just those two cities that were destroyed. The surrounding places were destroyed as well. And so archaeologists believe that these two cities were connected with that destruction in Genesis 18. So basically, what God is saying here is you're not, Sodom and Gomorrah were wiped off the face of the earth. That's not going to happen to you. Even though you're going into exile now, your ultimate end is going to be restoration and reconciliation with God. And when he says in verse 9, explaining all this, he says, "For I am God and no mortal." In other words, the reason why I'm going to treat you with justice is because I'm not like you. I'm not going to just turn away from you forever. I'm not going to treat you like a man would or a human being would. I'm going to treat you like your loving father, you've turned away from me, you've went away. There's going to be a time of discipline, but ultimately there's going to be restoration. And this is a theme that, again, comes out throughout the book of Hosea. If you go down to verse 11 in the same passage, he says that they shall come trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria, and I will return them to their homes, says the Lord. Verse 11. So even though there was that exile, there would be eventual restoration. What are your thoughts on that?
It shows like his compassion, his real true love, compassion, like you were talking about, love and whatever. I mean, like when my daddy corrects me, my earthly daddy, when he corrects me, he's not doing it just to be mean. He's doing it out of love, and I think it's the same thing. Like
right.
The whole book of Hosea, it's like repent. I mean, that's kind of like the whole thing, like, like later it almost seems like they're kind of wanting to do that, but then it's like still showing like he'll buy them back. Even look at all this bad stuff, he still buys them back, makes them wait. And then like I had actually underlined this in my other Bible because that kind of stood out to me too about how like when we think the dove is very gentle, right?
Right.
And then like the birds of Egypt. Well, when I think of Egypt, not a good place. We got them out of Egypt, and then like the doves from Assyria. Assyria is still not a good portion of the land, but they're gentle, so that has, I don't know, in my mind, there's something there. I haven't really dug into that mindset and that thought. But he'll settle them in their homes. He's going to take care of them. When he turns back to them. I think the whole message through Hosea is just like turn back to God and turn back to him. He says that, I think, throughout many people turn back to him.
Yeah, he invites them back into a relationship, but they kept going away.
He is that loving and caring.
Yeah, I like this line. He said, "My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender." Though they had deserved what was coming to them, he still had compassion for them. And I think we felt like that before. When you're at the grocery store and a kid's acting up and the parent gets on to them, sometimes you go, "Oh, poor kid." But you still know that they need to be gotten on to, Anybody else have something there?
This reminds me of me and my son.
Oh, yeah?
Sometimes he would get just so frustrated. I'd say, "Do it your way," And then he would come to me and he's like, "I can't do it." I said, "Well, did you finish doing it your way?" Like, "Yeah, I can't figure it out." I'm like, "Okay, now we do it my way."
Yeah.
Because I can't. And I think that this is what this is saying. To me, that's what this is saying. They did it their way. They knew God's way before, but they did it their way, and God let them fall into disrepair, I guess you'd say, or all of their things. And he said, after you pay for your punishment, you'll come back. He says, I'm not going to give up on you just because you're my son. I'm not going to love you any less. You just learn from your mistakes, and now come back to me.
Exactly. And again he says, I'm not going to treat you like a mortal would. I'm not man. I'm going to treat you like a God who's full of love and compassion.
That shows his mercy too, right there.
That's right. And because God is merciful towards them, that's what he wants them to do for others. Look at Hosea chapter 12 and verse 6. There's another passage that I picked out as I was reading through Hosea. Hosea 12 verse 6. He says, as for you, return to your God, hold fast to love and justice, and wait continually for your God. Again, it's this theme of God wants the people to emulate who God is. And the best way they can do that is by walking in justice and mercy and love. If they turn away from those things, then they're turning away from the one true God, and they're turning to a creation of their own hands. All right, let's see. Do you have anything else here in Hosea chapters, I think we did 8 through 11, or 8 through 12? Do you have anything else in these 3 or 4 chapters here? Josh?
So in Hosea 10, he talks about the high places of Haven. And this is one of the examples of where us speaking English is a barrier to understanding it. Some translations probably say there the house of nothingness or vanity is what he's saying. And he's talking about the places that Jeroboam has turned into sites of pagan worship. And you see it, especially when he says Beth Haven, which is a play on the word for Bethel, which means house of God, and was a place of worship. But when they turned it into a place of idol worship, now Hosea isn't calling it house of God, he's calling it house of nothingness. Beth Haven.
That's good. That's a good connection.
Well, there's nothing left. I mean, there was no more Beth Haven. You said house of God. I mean, there was no God in it at the time, so there was nothing left. You said it's an empty space.
Yeah.
And when you push God away, there's nothing but emptiness. And it takes a while for people to learn that.
Yep.
Sometimes a whole lifetime, right? All right, let's take a look at. Well, before we do that, does anybody else have anything in Hosea chapter 12? Or Hosea 8 through 12, I should say? Okay, let's go to Hosea chapter 12 and verse 10. And we're going to kind of bring this class to a close here in Hosea 12. And then next week we'll look at Hosea 13 and 14. And then we'll go to Amos after that, so that'll be good. Remind me if I forget for some reason, remind me to print out and give you your Amos worksheets for next week. Or I should say, remind me next Sunday to give you the Amos worksheets so you can read through Amos before the next class. Okay, Hosea 12, verse 10. I spoke to the prophets, it was I who fulfilled the visions, and through the prophets I will bring destruction. That line there, through the prophets I'll bring destruction. What do you think that means? Through the prophets I bring destruction.
Mine says I gave parables.
You said you what now?
Mine says I gave parables.
To tell parables. Okay. What other versions are out there?
Mine says I have given symbols through the witness of the prophets.
Okay. Symbols, parables. Probably parables of destruction. What else you got? In Hosea chapter 12 and verse 10.
I think here's the teaching lesson. He's saying that these are the tools that I've given you.
Yeah. Somebody else? Tina?
I've seen multiple prophets out there and talk to them, and they wouldn't know if I listened to them.
That's right.
Just telling them they've been warned.
Yeah, I mean, he's seen a bunch of them.
Exactly. And I think that's the point. I think y'all are all on it here. And that is that he didn't just leave them without warning. He gave them warning after warning after warning. He warned them through parables and symbols, like y'all mentioned. He warned them through sermons and visions, as he mentions in verse 10. And yet, for some reason, they were still unwilling to listen. So the question is really, are we willing to listen? Are we willing to listen to the warning of the prophets that, hey, when you walk down this path, this is where it leads? Are we willing to listen to the correction of Jesus? When you live out of sync with love or out of sync with justice, this is where it leads. Because I think that we sometimes read this and we go, how silly of them to not pay attention to the prophets. And then we kind of do the same thing, right? We kind of walk in the same ways they did. He says in verse 13, kind of the same theme there, by a prophet the Lord brought Israel up from Egypt, and by a prophet he was guarded. So the prophets led the people out of Egypt, the prophets guarded them, the prophets also warned them, and the prophets would also bring about their destruction through their prophecies. It's kind of the full picture you get there in Hosea chapter 12. In other words, somebody who speaks on behalf of God can be your best friend. They can be the one who leads you in fields of righteousness. They can be the one who leads you to safety, but they're also the one that you need to listen to. Sometimes when we read Scripture, we like reading the good parts and we don't want to read the bad parts. You know, the things that commend us for doing so good, the things that seem to line up with like who we are and what we're all about, those are great. But the parts that convict us, the parts that step on our toes a little bit, we don't really want those parts as much. We want the prophet in the time of safety, but we don't want the prophet in times of distress. We'd rather not listen, right? And that's human nature, I suppose. But what we have to do is, as the Hebrews writer commended his audience and told us, and actually commanded his audiences, to look at discipline from God as a gift, as a time of preparation or as a time of growth, instead of shrinking away from it. The prophets saved them from Egypt. They brought them up out of the land of Egypt. The prophets guarded them, but it was also through the prophets that the visions of destruction came. Yeah. All right, you got anything else in Hosea 8 through 12 before we close here? All right, we only have 2 chapters left in Hosea and our overview of Hosea, Hosea 13, Hosea 14. If I were you over the next week, if you have a free moment, what I would do is get back out that sheet of New Testament references to the Old Testament and see if you can find any in Hosea 13 and 14. That'll probably be a good way to spend your time if you got daily Bible reading planned out each day. All right, let's close there. Thank y'all for coming.
That was quite an accomplishment.
That's the fastest we moved, wasn't it?